A decorated detective uncovered a fentanyl empire run by her own captain. So he shot her and left her to freeze in a storm drain. But he didn't count on a Navy SEAL and a retired war dog finding her in the snow. Now the corrupt force that tried to bury her is about to learn they woke up the wrong enemy. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. They said no one cares about stories of discipline, courage, and service. If you do, subscribe and stand with this channel. I enjoy stories more when I imagine them myself, so that's how I tell mine. This story isn't just meant to be watched. It's meant to be imagined. The wind howling off Lake Michigan didn't just blow, it cut, carrying the kind of bone-deep chill that residents of Chicago called the Hawk, a relentless force that scoured the streets and froze the breath in your lungs before you could even exhale. It was a Tuesday night in late January, and the city was locked in the iron grip of a deep freeze, the mercury hovering well below zero, leaving the industrial district along the river desolate and ghostly under the amber glow of flickering street lamps. Snow flurries danced erratically in the biting air, dusting the gray concrete with a fine, glittering powder that crunched underfoot, creating a rhythmic cadence that was the only sound in the vast emptiness. Cillian Reaper Kane, a man of imposing stature with broad shoulders that seemed to carry an invisible weight, ran through this frozen landscape with a stride that was both powerful and disciplined, the steam rising from his body like smoke from a dying fire. He was 34 years old, though his eyes, a piercing steel blue that had seen too much of the world's darkness, made him look older, etched with the quiet, weary vigilance of a Navy SEAL currently on mandatory psychological leave. He wasn't running for fitness. He was running to exhaust the demons that came with the silence of civilian life, trying to outpace the memories of an ambush in Yemen where he watched his entire team die in a hail of gunfire that he somehow survived. The guilt of being the only one to walk away gnawed at him every night when the world got too quiet. Running beside him, matching his pace with effortless grace, was Phantom, a massive black German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes that missed nothing, his ears swiveling constantly, like radar dishes tuning into frequencies human ears could never perceive. Phantom was 6 years old, a retired military working dog who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. To anyone else, Phantom was just a dog, but to Cillian he was an anchor, the only living thing that truly understood the language of silence and survival. A brother in arms who had dragged wounded soldiers from kill zones and now dragged Cillian out of bed every morning when the depression threatened to take hold. They moved together as one unit, a silent partnership forged in fire and cemented in the ice of this lonely city. The rhythmic slap of Cillian's running shoes and the soft clicking of Phantom's claws on the pavement were the only disruptions to the winter stillness, until they reached a particularly desolate stretch near the old meatpacking district, where the smell of frozen river water mixed with the metallic tang of industrial decay. Suddenly, Phantom broke formation. His body went rigid as he skidded to a halt near a rusted storm drain grate, the kind that led down into Chicago's vast underground sewer system. He didn't bark. Phantom was trained better than that. But a low, vibrating growl rumbled deep in his chest, the hair along his spine standing up in a jagged ridge. Cillian stopped immediately, his breath pluming in the air as he turned to look at his companion, knowing that Phantom never gave a false alert. If the dog was agitated, something was wrong. "What is it, buddy?" Cillian whispered, his voice raspy from the cold air, his hand instinctively going to the concealed waistband of his running pants where a tactical knife was tucked, old habits dying hard even in a city that was supposed to be safe. Phantom trotted toward the storm drain grate, whining softly and looking back at Cillian with an urgency that sent a shiver down the SEAL's spine that had nothing to do with the winter wind. The dog pawed at the metal grating, his breath condensing in rapid bursts. Cillian approached cautiously, his senses heightening, the world narrowing down to the immediate threat radius as he scanned the perimeter for movement. But the street remained empty, abandoned. As he neared the grate, the smell hit him, not just the rot of the sewers, but the sharp, unmistakable copper scent of fresh blood cutting through the cold air. Cillian dropped to his knees in the slush, clicking on the small tactical flashlight he always carried, and shone the beam down into the darkness of the storm drain. At the bottom of the concrete culvert, partially submerged in freezing black water and gray slush, was a body. It was a woman. Her dark hair was matted with blood and grime, her skin pale as moonlight against the dark filth of the drain. She was wearing a police uniform, but it was tattered, the heavy tactical vest partially unstrapped, her badge torn from her chest, and her face swollen, bearing the brutal marks of a severe beating. This was Detective Sofia Reeves, a woman Cillian didn't know yet, but whose resilience was evident even in her unconscious state. She wasn't a large woman, perhaps in her late 20s, but the calluses on her hands and the determined set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness, suggested a fighter who hadn't gone down easily. Cillian didn't hesitate. He wrenched the heavy grate aside with a screech of rusted metal and dropped down into the culvert, the freezing water soaking his shoes instantly, ignoring the shock of the cold as he knelt beside her. His fingers pressed against the carotid artery in her neck, searching for the thrum of life. It was there, weak, thready, and erratic, fluttering like a trapped bird against his fingertips. But she was alive. "Hang on, officer. I've got you," Cillian murmured, his voice steady and calm, a stark contrast to the adrenaline flooding his system. He began a rapid assessment of her injuries, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a combat medic, noting 2 gunshot wounds, one in her lower abdomen, one in her left shoulder, that had been hastily bandaged with strips of cloth, likely her own doing before she passed out. She was hypothermic, her skin ice-cold to the touch, and if he didn't get her warm soon, the cold would finish what the bullets hadn't. As he shifted her slightly to check for exit wounds, something clattered against the concrete floor of the drain. He shone his light on it, and his heart hardened. It was her police badge, bent, smashed, stomped on repeatedly with a heavy boot until the star was barely recognizable. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. The broken badge was a message, a symbol of betrayal and targeted hatred. Her hand was clenched around something else, a small USB drive on a lanyard, clutched so tightly her knuckles were white even in death's grip. Cillian carefully pried her fingers open and took it, slipping it into his pocket. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the emergency dial for 911, but he paused. His eyes darted back to the smashed badge, the isolated location of this dump site, the execution-style wounds. His instincts, honed in environments where trust was a luxury and betrayal could be fatal, screamed a warning that this was an execution attempt, likely by her own kind, or someone powerful enough to control them. If he called it in on an open line, he might just be calling the executioners back to finish the job. Before he could make a decision, Phantom, who was guarding the rim of the storm drain above, dropped into a silent down position, his ears pinned back flat against his skull. The signal for an approaching threat. Cillian instantly killed his flashlight, plunging the culvert back into pitch darkness, and grabbed Sofia, dragging her deeper into the concrete tunnel, away from the opening, pressing her body against the freezing curved wall. The sound of tires crunching on snow grew louder, slow and deliberate. Not the passing whoosh of traffic, but the prowling crawl of a predator. A vehicle stopped directly above them on the service road, the engine idling with a deep, throaty rumble that sounded like a large SUV. Cillian held his breath, pressing a hand gently over Sofia's mouth just in case she regained consciousness and cried out, while he used his other hand to signal Phantom to stay. The dog didn't twitch, blending perfectly with the shadows of the night, a silent guardian watching the enemy. Car doors opened and slammed shut, the heavy thud echoing ominously in the silence, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel and the murmur of low, agitated male voices. "I'm telling you, I hit her twice." A man's voice drifted down, rough and irritated, carried by the wind. "She crawled off like a rat. Check the drain." Cillian's muscles coiled like springs, his mind shifting seamlessly into combat mode as he calculated the angles. He had a knife and the element of surprise, but he was protecting a critical casualty and had a dog to worry about. Beams of high-powered flashlights sliced through the darkness above, sweeping back and forth across the snow, the light dancing dangerously close to the rim of the storm drain, where Phantom lay hidden in the brush. Cillian pressed himself flatter into the muck, the freezing water seeping into his clothes, numbing his skin, but he didn't flinch. His focus was absolute. One of the lights swung down toward the opening of the culvert, illuminating the spot where Sofia had been lying just minutes ago. "See?" Nothing, another voice said, dismissive and cold. Current probably dragged her under, or she's frozen stiff by now. Let's go. Boss is waiting. The light lingered for a heart-stopping second, illuminating the eye of bloodstain on the concrete, which was now rapidly being covered by the fresh snowfall, before swinging away. Cillian didn't move a muscle until the car doors slammed again and the sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving only the howling wind in its wake. He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, the white puff vanishing instantly in the dark. He looked down at Sofia, whose breathing was becoming shallower, the cold seeping into her broken body with every passing second. He couldn't leave her here, and he couldn't call for an ambulance that might be intercepted. He needed a safe harbor, a place off the grid where he could stabilize her without alerting the wolves hunting her. He thought of the old boathouse his family still owned, a few miles downriver, a relic of a bygone era that nobody paid attention to anymore. It was risky, but it was the only card he had to play. He carefully lifted Sofia into his arms, her weight negligible against his strength, but heavy with responsibility. Phantom, heel, he whispered. The dog appeared instantly at the rim, looking down with concern. Cillian began the difficult climb out of the darkness, carrying the broken detective toward an uncertain salvation, knowing that tonight, the quiet run was over, and a new war had just begun in the frozen heart of Chicago. The boathouse sat on a forgotten stretch of the Chicago River, a relic of the city's industrial past that Cillian's grandfather had bought decades ago. It was a sturdy structure of weathered brick and corrugated iron, hidden from the main waterways by the rusted skeleton of a defunct crane. Inside, floating in the dark water of the slip, was the Molly Rose, an old trawler converted into a living space that, despite its peeling paint, was dry and warm. Cillian carried Sofia across the gangplank, the wood groaning softly under his boots, while Phantom trotted ahead to push open the cabin door with his nose. The air inside smelled of diesel, old cedar, and the faint, comforting scent of coffee that lingered from Cillian's last visit. He laid Sofia gently on the built-in bunk in the main cabin, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that filled the small space with the terrifying sound of a life hanging in the balance. He didn't waste a second. He pulled a burner phone from a hidden compartment under the chart table and dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "It's 3 a.m, Kane. You better be dying or buying." The voice belonged to Liam Doc O'Malley, a 72-year-old retired Army combat medic who had served 2 tours in Vietnam with Cillian's father. Doc was a man carved from granite, with hands that had steadied under mortar fire and eyes that had seen the worst of humanity, yet somehow remained kind. "I need you at the boathouse, Doc," Cillian said, his voice low and urgent. "Gunshot wounds. Bad shape. Bring the kit. And Doc, come quiet. I'm already putting my boots on," was the only reply before the line went dead. 20 minutes later, the distinct sound of a heavy van rolling to a stop on the gravel outside signaled Doc's arrival. The older man entered carrying a battered medical bag that looked as old as he was. He was short and stout, with a shock of white hair and a face lined like a roadmap of hard years. He took one look at Sofia, then at Cillian, and finally at the blood-soaked uniform. "Police," Doc noted, stripping off his heavy coat to reveal suspenders over a flannel shirt. "You sure know how to pick them, son. Get the water boiling and turn up every lamp you have. I need light." The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. Cillian acted as nurse, handing instruments and holding retractors while Doc worked with a precision that belied his age. Phantom sat in the corner, his eyes fixed on Sofia, a low whine escaping his throat every time she flinched in her unconscious state. As Doc removed the second bullet from her abdomen, Sofia's body seized up, her mind trapped in a feverish nightmare of the hours before she was shot. In her delirium, she wasn't on a boat. She was back in the precinct, standing outside Captain Marcus Holloway's office, the door slightly ajar. She could hear his voice, smooth as silk and just as slippery, negotiating a price for something that wasn't his to sell. "The badge," she muttered, tossing her head on the pillow, sweat beading on her forehead. "He sold it. Holloway, the evidence locker. Fentanyl. He's moving it. 500 kilos. Cillian wiped her brow with a cool cloth. "She's delirious. Document." "She's fighting," Doc corrected, dropping a bloody slug into a metal basin with a clink. Infection is setting in fast. I've cleaned it out and stitched her up, but she needs heavy antibiotics and luck. I'm giving her a sedative to keep her under, but her temperature is spiking. Keep her warm, but not hot. If the fever breaks tonight, she lives. If not, he didn't finish the sentence. He packed up his bag, placing a hand on Cillian's shoulder. I'll leave the meds. You watch her. I'll go clear my tracks outside. Once Doc left, the silence of the boat returned, heavier than before. Cillian stepped out onto the small aft deck, the cold air hitting him like a slap. He needed to make one more call, one that carried treasonous weight if he wasn't careful. He pulled out a sleek black satellite phone, military issue, and extended the antenna. The connection encrypted instantly. "Commander," Cillian said when the line connected. He didn't give his name. "Report, Kane." The voice on the other end was clipped, authoritative. It was Commander Vance, his commanding officer back at Coronado. "I have a situation. Local law enforcement compromised. I found an officer down, claims knowledge of a large-scale fentanyl operation being run by a police captain. She mentioned 500 kilos moving through an evidence locker. If this is real, sir, it's a mass casualty event waiting to happen." There was a long silence on the line, the kind that usually preceded a drone strike or a denial of existence. "We've had DEA alerts about Chicago for months," Vance said, his tone dropping an octave. "Massive amounts of fentanyl disappearing from evidence lockups. If a captain is dirty and moving that volume, the rules of engagement just changed. You are authorized for Operation Clean House. This is off the books, Kane. You recover the asset, you neutralize the threat. We were never there. Do you understand?" "Understood, sir." "What about the detective? If she's an asset, use her. If she's a liability, make a judgment call. Cut her out." Cillian lowered the phone, the weight of the order settling on him. He wasn't just saving a life anymore. He was stopping a threat that could kill thousands. He went back inside. The cabin was sweltering. He had cranked the heater as Doc instructed, but Sofia was shaking violently, her teeth chattering with the bone-deep chill of sepsis. "No, don't," she whimpered, thrashing against the blankets. Phantom stood up and padded over to the bunk, resting his heavy head on her chest, trying to ground her. Suddenly, the cabin was illuminated by a sweeping spotlight from outside. Through the porthole, Cillian saw the red and blue flashing lights of a police patrol boat cruising slowly down the river, scanning the banks. If they saw movement or heard a scream, they would board. And if Holloway was as powerful as Sofia's delirium suggested, a patrol boat finding them wouldn't mean rescue. It would mean an execution at sea. Sofia's eyes snapped open, unseeing and wild. She opened her mouth to scream, a hallucination of her attacker looming over her. Cillian moved instantly. He didn't cover her mouth this time. Instead, he lay down on the narrow bunk beside her, pulling the heavy wool blankets over both of them. He wrapped his arms around her shivering frame, pressing her face into his chest to muffle any sound. "Quiet, Sofia. You're safe. I've got you," he whispered directly into her ear, his voice a low rumble. "Phantom, up," he commanded softly. The massive dog didn't hesitate. Phantom climbed onto the foot of the bunk, curling his large, warm body against Sofia's legs, effectively pinning her thrashing limbs down with his weight and warmth. Cillian sandwiched her between the wall, his own body heat, and the dog. He could feel the fever radiating off her skin, burning and terrifying, while the searchlight swept across the porthole, bathing the cabin in a brief, blinding white light. For 3 agonizing minutes, they lay frozen in that intimate tableau, a soldier, a broken cop, and a dog, huddled together in the dark belly of an old boat. Sofia's shaking began to subside, her body instinctively seeking the warmth Cillian and Phantom provided. Her breathing slowed, synchronizing with the steady rhythm of Cillian's heart against her ear. The patrol boat's engine faded into the distance, the wash of its wake rocking them gently. Sofia shifted slightly, her hand gripping Cillian's shirt in her sleep. Her fever was still high, but the violent shivering had stopped. She let out a soft sigh, burying her face deeper into the crook of his neck. Phantom rested his chin on Cillian's ankle, closing his eyes. In the darkness, Cillian realized that the judgment call his commander spoke of had already been made. She wasn't a liability. She was the mission now, and for the first time in a long time, The cold didn't feel quite so biting. The fever broke with the dawn, leaving Sofia Reeves weak but lucid, her mind clearing like the sky over Lake Michigan after a storm. By late morning, the snow had stopped, but the city remained buried under a blanket of white, the air crisp and biting. Cillian had moved them from the boat to a more mobile base of operations, a nondescript cargo van that smelled of grease and old tools, driven by a man whose laughter seemed to shake the vehicle's frame. They were parked behind Lou's Diner, a classic chrome and neon establishment on the outskirts of the city that looked like it had been transported straight from the 1950s. It was the kind of place where the coffee was strong, the pie was homemade, and nobody asked questions if you sat in a booth for 3 hours. This was the meeting point. Cillian helped Sofia out of the van, her arm draped over his shoulder for support, while Phantom scanned the alleyway, his ears twitching at the distant sound of traffic. "You're going to meet the family," Cillian said quietly, guiding her toward the back entrance. "They aren't pretty, but they're loyal." Inside, the diner was warm and smelled of frying bacon and maple syrup. In a corner booth, far from the windows, 2 men sat waiting. Cillian introduced them simply. "Sofia, this is Rook and Breaker. They're the best friends a man could ask for in a fight." Marcus Rook Stone was a mountain of a man, an African-American sniper in his late 30s, with skin the color of deep mahogany and eyes that were unsettlingly still. He didn't move much, his economy of motion suggesting a man who could wait days for a single second of opportunity. Sitting opposite him was Danny Breaker Kowalski, a stocky Polish-American with grease-stained knuckles and a grin that took up half his face. Breaker was the team's mechanic and demolitions expert, a man who could fix an engine with a bobby pin or level a building with a chemistry set, all while cracking a joke. "Good to meet you, Detective," Breaker said, sliding a cup of coffee toward her. "Cillian says you're tough. Anyone who can crawl through a Chicago sewer in January earns a free pass in my book." Rook just nodded, a slow, solemn acknowledgement that felt heavier than any handshake. "We've got your 6, he said, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated through the table. Sofia wrapped her hands around the warm mug, feeling a sudden, overwhelming sense of safety she hadn't felt in days. These men weren't just soldiers. They were a brotherhood, bound by a code that transcended uniforms and orders. "The evidence," she began, her voice raspy but steady, "isn't at the precinct. I knew Holloway would tear my desk apart the moment he suspected me. I put the USB drive in a rental locker at Union Station. Locker 404. It's inside my gym bag." She looked down at the table, her hands trembling slightly. "It has everything. The manifest, the evidence locker logs, recordings of Holloway negotiating the sale of 500 kilos of fentanyl. It proves he's been redistributing seized drugs back onto the streets for 2 years. But there's more." She paused, her voice cracking. "There's a shipment happening in 48 hours. 2 tons of pure fentanyl, enough to kill 100,000 people, being moved through a federal evidence transfer to a Mexican cartel. He's got a partner in the DEA helping him bypass oversight." The gravity of her words hung in the air, silencing even Breaker for a moment. But the quiet was shattered by the diner's television mounted above the counter. The midday news was on, and suddenly Sofia's face filled the screen. The headline screamed in bold red letters, "Manhunt for Rogue Cop. Detective Sofia Reeves wanted for murder of partner and evidence theft." The news anchor, a woman with a severe expression, read the report. "Captain Marcus Holloway held a press conference this morning, pleading for Detective Reeves to surrender, citing a mental breakdown and dangerous obsession with conspiracy theories. Authorities say she murdered her partner, Detective Alan Ramos, and stole evidence from a secured locker. She is considered armed and extremely dangerous." Sofia gasped, shrinking back into the booth as if the patrons could see her through the screen. He turned it around. She whispered, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "He's calling me the traitor. My father was a cop. My grandfather was a cop. He's burying my name." Cillian reached across the table, covering her trembling hand with his own. His grip was firm, grounding her. "The news cycle lasts 24 hours, Sofia. Honor lasts a lifetime. We get that drive, we clear your name, and we bury him." Rook turned his gaze from the TV to Sofia, his expression hardening. "They control the narrative because they have the microphone. We change the story when we bring the truth. Union Station, Breaker said, pulling out a napkin and sketching a rough layout. That's the target. The plan was formulated quickly, drawn on napkins with military precision. Union Station would be crowded, a hub of commuters and tourists, the perfect cover for an extraction, but also a nightmare for security. No guns, Cillian ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Too many civilians. If we start a firefight in a train station, we lose the moral high ground, and we confirm their story, that we're the terrorists. We do this quiet. We do this clean. An hour later, they were walking into the great hall of Union Station. The sheer scale of the place was breathtaking, with its soaring barrel-vaulted skylight and massive Corinthian columns that echoed the grandeur of a Roman temple. Thousands of people moved across the marble floors, a river of coats and suitcases. Cillian, wearing a nondescript baseball cap and a heavy pea coat, moved through the crowd with Phantom heeling closely by his left leg. The dog wore a service vest now, looking every bit the professional working animal, which allowed them to pass security without a second glance. Rook had taken a position on the mezzanine level, leaning against a railing like a bored tourist, his eyes scanning the crowd for threats. Breaker was near the exits, pretending to fix a vending machine, ready to create a distraction if things went south. Sofia stayed in the van outside, monitoring police channels. She was too recognizable to go in. Approaching the lockers, Cillian murmured into his lapel mic, "Crowd is dense. Good cover." He reached the bank of lockers located in a less trafficked corridor near the Amtrak waiting area. He scanned the barcode Sofia had given him, and locker 404 popped open with a mechanical click. There, nestled inside a battered gym bag, was the silver USB drive. He palmed it instantly, slipping it into his inner pocket. Package secured, he whispered, moving toward extraction. But as he turned to leave, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. Phantom let out a low, menacing growl, pressing his body against Cillian's leg. 3 men were approaching from the end of the corridor. They weren't wearing police uniforms, and they didn't walk like commuters. They wore expensive wool coats that didn't quite conceal the bulk of body armor underneath, and their eyes were locked on Cillian. Mercenaries. Holloway had hired private contractors, men who wouldn't hesitate to kill in a crowd if the price was right. "Rook, I've got company," Cillian said, keeping his voice calm. 3 bogies, 6 o'clock. Private military contractors by the look of them. "I see them." Rook's voice crackled in his ear. 2 more flanking from the north entrance. "You're being boxed in. You can't go out the main way." The lead mercenary, a man with a scar running through his eyebrow, quickened his pace, reaching inside his coat. Cillian knew that if the man pulled a gun, panic would ensue. He had to end this before it started. He stepped into the flow of a passing tour group, using them as a human shield to close the distance without drawing attention. When the tour group turned, Cillian was suddenly face to face with the lead mercenary. The man smirked, opening his mouth to speak, perhaps to threaten, but Cillian moved with the explosive speed of a striking cobra. He grabbed the man's lapel and drove a stiff punch into his solar plexus, the blow short and devastating, knocking the wind out of him instantly. As the man doubled over, Cillian spun him around, slamming his head into the metal lockers with a dull thud that was masked by the station announcements. The other 2 mercenaries lunged. "Phantom, take him," Cillian commanded, pointing at the man on the left. The German Shepherd launched himself like a furry missile, clamping his jaws onto the mercenary's forearm. The man screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the screech of a train arriving on the platform nearby. Phantom dragged the man to the ground, standing over him with teeth bared, daring him to move. The 3rd mercenary hesitated, his hand twitching toward his holster. Cillian stepped in close, using a Krav Maga technique to trap the man's arm, twisting it violently until the shoulder joint popped. He swept the man's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the marble floor. "Stay down," Cillian hissed, his face inches from the mercenaries. "Tell Holloway his dogs need better training." "Police are moving in, Cillian." Uniforms coming from the East Wing. Someone reported the scuffle. Harley's voice was frantic in his ear. "Get out of there." Cillian whistled sharply, and Phantom released his prisoner, trotting back to Cillian's side instantly. They merged back into the crowd of commuters rushing toward the departing train, disappearing into the sea of humanity just as two uniformed officers rounded the corner to find three groaning men on the floor. Cillian moved swiftly toward the service exit breaker had propped open, stepping out into the biting cold of the loading dock where the van was waiting, engine idling. He slid the doors shut behind him, breathless but unharmed. He pulled the USB drive from his pocket and held it up. "We got it," he said, looking at Sofia. She was staring at the monitor, tears drying on her cheeks, replaced by a look of fierce determination. The team was safe. The evidence was secure. And for the first time, the ghosts of the past didn't seem quite so terrifying. They had the truth, and they were ready to declare war. The safe house breaker had secured was a decommissioned fire station on the outskirts of the industrial district, a brick fortress that smelled of old diesel and cold ash. Outside, the Chicago winter had deepened, the temperature dropping until the air itself felt brittle. But inside, the tension was hot enough to blister paint. Ghost, the team's tech specialist, sat hunched over a bank of monitors, his fingers flying across a backlit keyboard. Ghost was a slight, wiry man in his early 40s, with thick glasses and a nervous energy that only settled when he was looking at code. He was a former NSA analyst who had traded his clearance for a conscience years ago. "It's a rolling cipher," Ghost muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. "Military grade. Holloway didn't build this, he bought it. I can see the file names, bank accounts, shipping manifests, evidence locker logs, but they're locked behind a biometric root key. Without the password, this drive is just a very expensive paperweight. If I force it, the data wipes itself." Sofia stood behind him, staring at the screen, her reflection pale and ghostly against the scrolling code. She knew there was only one person who would have access to the root directory without triggering the alarms. A man who had served as the precinct's moral compass long before Holloway turned it into a marketplace for corruption. "Lieutenant Cortez," Sofia said, the name tasting like hope and fear. "He was the systems administrator before Holloway pushed him into semi-retirement. He taught me everything I know about being a cop. If anyone has the back door, it's him." Lieutenant James Cortez was a relic of a bygone era. A 58-year-old patrol lieutenant with knees ruined by years of walking the beat and a heart that still believed in the sanctity of the badge. He was the kind of man who polished his shoes every morning and knew the names of every shopkeeper in his district. Sofia picked up the burner phone, her hand trembling slightly as she dialed the number she had memorized as a rookie. It rang 4 times before a gruff, familiar voice answered, sounding weary and heavy with the weight of the last few days. "I was wondering when you'd call, kid." Cortez's voice was devoid of the accusation Sofia had feared. "The news says you're a traitor. I told the captain that was hogwash. You're stubborn, Sofia, and maybe a bit reckless, but you don't break your oath." "I didn't, sir," Sofia choked out, tears stinging her eyes. "Holloway is the one. He's been selling fentanyl, Lieutenant, redistributing evidence. We have the proof, but we can't open the files. I need the admin key." There was a long silence on the line, heavy with the gravity of the request. Cortez sighed, a sound like old paper tearing. "I knew something was rotting in the department. I just didn't want to look at it. The badge, it used to mean something, Sofia. It wasn't just metal to shield us. It was a promise to the people who couldn't fight back. Holloway turned it into a permission slip for greed." His voice hardened, regaining some of the command tone Sofia remembered from the academy. "I can't give it to you over the phone. The line isn't secure. Meet me at Oak Ridge Veterans Cemetery, Section 9, by the memorial wall. 1 hour. Come alone. Or at least don't let me see your shadows." Sofia hung up, looking at Cillian. "He'll help. But we have to move now, while we still have time." While Sofia prepared, Cillian sat on a bench near the old fire truck bay, methodically cleaning his weapons. It was a ritual of focus, a way to quiet the mind before the storm. He disassembled his Sig Sauer P226, the smell of Hoppa's No. 9 solvent and gun oil filling the air, a scent that was both pungent and strangely comforting to men who lived by the gun. He wiped the slide down with a rag, checking the firing pin and the recoil spring with practiced ease, his movements fluid and precise. Next to him lay an M4 carbine, stripped down to its receivers. Phantom sat on his haunches a few feet away, watching Cillian's hands with intense focus, his amber eyes tracking every movement of the reassembly. The dog sensed the shift in his master's energy. The quiet sorrow of the runner was gone, replaced by the cold, sharp edge of the warrior. Cillian snapped the bolt carrier group back into the upper receiver of the rifle with a sharp metallic click that echoed in the cavernous space. He looked at the dog. "Work time, Phantom," he said softly. The dog stood and shook himself, the jingle of his collar the only sound of dissent against the grim preparation. This technical preparation wasn't just maintenance. It was a warrior's prayer, a plea to the god of mechanics that when the moment came, the machine would not fail the man. The Oak Ridge Veterans Cemetery was a sprawling landscape of rolling white hills, dotted with thousands of identical white stone markers standing in silent formation like an eternal army. The snow lay undisturbed, a pristine blanket covering the resting places of heroes from wars past. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow as Cillian, Rook, and Sofia approached Section 9. They left the van a mile back. Rook had peeled off to find a high vantage point in a bell tower overlooking the memorial, while Cillian and Phantom moved through the tree line, using the massive oaks for cover. Sofia walked the main path alone, her breath pluming in the freezing air, her hands raised slightly to show she was unarmed. She spotted Cortez standing by the black granite memorial wall, a solitary figure in a long trench coat, his back to her. He looked small against the vastness of the dead, a lonely sentinel waiting for his final watch. "Lieutenant," Sofia called out softly, stopping 10 yards away. Cortez didn't turn around. His posture was rigid, unnatural. "Don't come any closer, Sofia." Cortez's voice was strained, tight with pain and fear. "I'm sorry. They were waiting at my house. They threatened my wife, my grandkids. I didn't have a choice." Cillian, watching through his scope from the tree line, saw the glint of a tripwire running from Cortez's coat to the granite wall. "It's a trap," Cillian whispered into his comms. "Sofia, get back." But it was too late. Floodlights blinded them from the perimeter of the cemetery, turning the twilight into a harsh, artificial noon. Captain Marcus Holloway's voice boomed from a loudspeaker hidden in the trees, smooth and mocking. "Touching reunion. Truly. I knew you'd reach out to the old man, Sofia. Sentiment is your weakness." Cortez slowly turned around. His coat was open, revealing a horrifying sight. He was strapped with a vest of C4 explosives, and a grenade was taped to his chest, the pin already pulled, held in place only by his trembling hand. "He wants the drive, Sofia," Cortez shouted, tears freezing on his cheeks. "He said he'd let you go if you give it up. But he's lying. He's going to kill us all." Cillian broke cover, raising his rifle, but he couldn't shoot. A bullet would drop Cortez, and his hand would release the spoon of the grenade, detonating the vest. Phantom growled, sensing the impossible standoff. Holloway's voice laughed. "Throw the drive on the ground, and I won't turn the lieutenant into pink mist. You have 10 seconds. Cortez looked at Sofia, and in that moment, the fear vanished from his eyes, replaced by a steel resolve that Sofia had seen 1,000 times on the streets. He straightened his back, reclaiming his dignity one last time. "The password," Cortez yelled, his voice echoing across the silent graves. "The password is Semper Fi 1988. Remember it. Clear your name, Sofia." "No," Sofia screamed. But Cortez was already moving. He didn't run toward Sofia. He turned and sprinted with shocking speed toward the tree line where Holloway's voice had originated, toward the hidden mercenaries. "Get down," Cillian roared, tackling Sofia into the snow behind a marble mausoleum. Phantom leaped over them, using his body as a shield. Cortez released the grenade lever as he threw himself into the brush where the mercenaries were advancing. "For the badge," he screamed. The explosion was deafening, a thunderclap that shook the ground and shattered the silence of the dead. A massive fireball erupted, tearing through the trees and sending a shockwave that knocked the snow from the branches for 100 yards. Debris rained down on Cillian and Sofia, dirt, stone, and the heartbreaking remnants of a good man. The blast had decimated the mercenary flank, creating a chaotic opening. "Move. Go now," Cillian shouted, dragging a stunned and sobbing Sofia to her feet. Rook's rifle began to crack from the tower, providing covering fire as Cillian, Sofia, and Phantom sprinted through the smoke and snow, leaving behind the crater that marked the final resting place of a true hero. They had the key, but the price had been paid in blood, and the weight of it threatened to crush them as they vanished into the winter night. The safe house was a converted industrial salt storage facility on the southern edge of the city, a cavernous structure of corrugated steel and reinforced concrete that seemed to disappear into the blinding white of the blizzard raging outside. Inside, the air was cold, smelling of stale dust and the ozone tang of overheated electronics. But it was a sanctuary compared to the violent chaos they had left behind at the cemetery. The silence in the room was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on Cillian, Sofia, and the rest of the team. It was the specific, suffocating silence that follows the death of a good man. Lieutenant Cortez was gone, his life extinguished in a flash of fire and defiance to buy them time. And the cost of their survival was etched into every line of Sofia's face. She sat on a crate near a kerosene heater, staring blankly at the concrete floor, her hands still stained with soot and dirt, trembling, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline crash and the crushing grief of losing the only father figure she had left on the force. Phantom, sensing the thick blanket of sorrow in the room, lay at her feet, his chin resting on his paws, his amber eyes fixed on her with an unwavering, soulful intensity. The dog understood loss. He had seen empty bunks in the barracks and heard taps played too many times. He knew that this was the time for stillness. Cillian stood by the frosted window, watching the snow swirl in the floodlights of the perimeter, his reflection ghostly in the glass. He felt the familiar burn of anger deep in his chest, the cold, directed rage of a warrior who has seen innocence sacrificed for greed. But rage without direction was useless. He turned to the team. Rook was cleaning his rifle with methodical, almost meditative slow movements in the corner, while Breaker and Ghost were huddled over a bank of monitors set up on a folding table. Ghost, the nervous tech specialist, was typing furiously, the blue light of the screens reflecting in his thick glasses. "We can't just sit here and mourn him," Cillian said, his voice low but cutting through the silence like a knife. "Cortez didn't die so we could host a wake in a warehouse. He died to give us the key. We need to turn that key and finish this." Sofia looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but hardening. "Holloway thinks he won," she said, her voice raspy. "He thinks destroying the messenger destroys the message." "Then let's prove him wrong," Cillian replied, walking over to the table. "Ghost, what's the status on the drive?" Ghost pushed his glasses up his nose. "The password," Cortez shouted. "Semper Fi 1988. It worked. The drive is open. It's all here, Cillian. The entire ledger. Holloway isn't just selling to cartels. He's been offloading fentanyl for 2 years. But there's more." He pulled up a file, his face pale. "There's a shipment happening tonight. 2 tons of pure fentanyl being moved through a federal evidence transfer to a Mexican cartel contact. The transfer point is Pier 9, near O'Hare. And he's got a partner, a corrupt DEA supervisor named Agent Richard Voss. Voss is using federal task force credentials to bypass security and legitimize the transport." Breaker slammed his fist on the table. "If we send this to the FBI now, they'll wrap it in red tape for a week. By the time they get a warrant, Holloway will be gone, and those drugs will be on a container ship." Cillian nodded. He knew the bureaucracy of justice was too slow for the speed of war. "We don't send it to the FBI yet," Cillian said. "We send it to Holloway." The plan was a high-stakes gamble of psychological warfare, the kind Cillian had used to flush out insurgents in the mountains of Kandahar. They would use the digital footprint of the dead man to haunt the living traitor. "Ghost, can you spoof a signal from Cortez's personal cloud account?" Cillian asked. "Make it look like a dead man's switch?" Ghost cracked his knuckles, a thin smile touching his lips. "I can make it look like it's coming from inside his own house. I'll set up a delayed transmission. We send a text to Holloway's personal burner phone, the one listed in these files. We tell him the encryption key was automatically uploaded to the Chicago FBI field office server upon Cortez's heart stopping, with a 2-hour delay for processing." Cillian nodded. "Panic makes men sloppy. If he thinks the feds are rolling out in 2 hours, he won't hunker down. He'll try to move the product immediately. He has to get it onto international waters before the imaginary net closes." While Ghost set the trap, Cillian walked over to Sofia. She had picked up an M4 carbine that Breaker had laid out, holding it awkwardly, the weapon foreign in hands used to a police-issue Glock. "You're not going to be a cop tonight, Sofia," Cillian said softly. stepping into her personal space. Tonight, you're an operator. And if you hesitate, you die. He reached out, his large hands covering hers on the weapon, adjusting her grip. Elbows in. Don't fight the recoil, ride it. This isn't about law enforcement. This is about suppression and survival. He guided her body into a proper shooting stance, his chest brushing against her back, his voice a calm rumble in her ear. It wasn't romantic, but it was deeply intimate, a transfer of lethality and trust. Cortez gave you a chance, he whispered, feeling the tension in her shoulders. Don't waste it on guilt. Use the anger. Focus it down the barrel. That's how you honor him. Sofia took a deep breath, the smell of gun oil and Cillian's subtle scent of pine and wood smoke filling her senses, grounding her. She nodded, her grip on the rifle tightening, her stance cementing. She was transforming, shedding the skin of the victim and growing the armor of the avenger. As Cillian stepped back to check his own gear, Sofia sat back down, the weight of the rifle comforting across her lap. Phantom, who had been watching the training session with keen interest, stood up and trotted over to her. He didn't nudge her hand for a pet this time. Instead, he rooted around in a pile of gear Breaker had dumped on the floor and emerged with a ragged, slobber-soaked tennis ball, his most prized possession, a veteran of 1,000 games of fetch. He dropped the wet, dirty ball directly into Sofia's lap, then sat back and gave a soft woof, his tail thumping once against the floor. It was a gesture of such pure, uncomplicated love that it cracked the ice around Sofia's heart. He was sharing his joy to heal her pain. Sofia picked up the ball, tears finally spilling over, but this time they were tears of release. She buried her face in Phantom's thick fur, hugging his massive neck. "Thank you, buddy," she whispered. Phantom licked the salt from her cheek, a silent promise that he was there, and he wasn't going anywhere. He took the bait. Ghost shout shattered the moment. Holloway just activated his encrypted comms. He's recalling his security teams. I'm tracking a massive spike in cellular activity near the waterfront. He's panicking. He's ordering the transport to move up. The extraction is happening now. Cillian moved to the map on the wall, where Ghost was typing rapidly, triangulating the signals. Pier 9. It's a private shipping terminal owned by a shell company in the files. Isolated. Deep water access. Perfect for a quick load. Cillian grabbed his vest, the sound of Velcro tearing echoing like gunfire. Rook, you're on overwatch. Breaker, prep the van. We hit them hard, and we hit them fast. No prisoners. No mercy. We are the cleaning crew. Sofia stood up, wiping her face. The tennis ball was tucked safely into her pocket. She racked the charging handle of the M4, the metallic clack sounding final and decisive. She looked at Cillian, her eyes clear and cold as the winter sky. "Let's go get him," she said. Cillian nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. The grieving daughter was gone. The warrior had arrived. They moved out into the snow, Phantom taking point. The storm outside, nothing compared to the one they were about to bring to Captain Holloway's doorstep. Pier 9 was a desolate expanse of concrete and steel jutting out into the churning black waters of Lake Michigan, a place where the city's industrial heartbeat slowed to a frozen crawl. The blizzard had intensified, turning the world into a swirling vortex of white that reduced visibility to a few yards, masking the approach of the black van that slid silently to a halt behind a stack of rusted shipping crates. Cillian Carter stepped out first, his breath invisible in the wind, his silhouette merging instantly with the shadows. He was dressed in full tactical gear now, the charcoal gray body armor and helmet making him look less like a man and more like a wraith of winter. Phantom jumped down beside him, his paws making no sound on the snow-dusted asphalt. His service vest was fitted with a small tactical camera and infrared strobe. The dog shook the snow from his coat, his body tense and vibrating with the anticipation of the hunt. Sofia followed, her M4 carbine held tight against her chest, her eyes wide as she took in the labyrinth of stacked containers that rose like monolithic tombstones around them. "Comms check," Cillian whispered. His voice transmitted clearly through the bone conduction headset Sofia now wore. 5x5, Rook's deep voice answered. Rook and Breaker had already peeled off, moving like shadows toward the towering gantry crane that loomed over the pier like a skeletal giant. They would be the eyes in the sky, raining down suppression from 200 feet up. "We're in position," Rook confirmed moments later. Thermal shows 20-plus heat signatures near the water. They're loading crates onto a hydrofoil. You've got armed sentries at every intersection. Cillian looked at Sofia, his face obscured by a balaclava, revealing only those piercing blue eyes. This is it, Sofia. Stick to my hip. If I move, you move. If I stop, you freeze. Do not engage unless you have a clear target and no choice. We are ghosts until we decide to be thunder. They moved into the maze. Cillian led the way, his movement fluid and predatory, gliding from one patch of darkness to another. He used hand signals exclusively, a silent language of war that Sofia had practiced in the warehouse, but now had to execute with life-or-death precision. A raised fist meant halt. A flat hand slicing the air meant enemy ahead. 2 fingers pointing to eyes meant watch. They advanced through the canyons of corrugated steel, the wind howling through the gaps, masking the soft crunch of their boots. At an intersection of containers, Cillian held up a fist. He peeked around the corner, then pulled back, signaling for Sofia to look. 20 yards away, standing under the halo of a halogen work light, were 2 men guarding a forklift. One was a private contractor, heavily armed. The other wore the dark blue parka of the Chicago Police Department. Sofia felt her breath hitch. She recognized the profile, Officer Danny Miller, a man she had shared donuts with in the break room, a man who had shown her pictures of his newborn daughter. Now he was holding an assault rifle, guarding a shipment of poison for a trader. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to her gut. I know him, Sofia whispered, her voice trembling over the comms. He's one of us. Cillian grabbed her shoulder, his grip iron hard. He was one of us, Cillian corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. Now he is a combatant facilitating mass murder. If he raises his weapon at you, he has made his choice. You have to make yours. He didn't give her time to dwell on it. He signaled to Phantom. The dog crept forward, low to the ground, blending perfectly with the dark, wet pavement. Cillian picked up a loose bolt from the ground and tossed it, clattering against a container far to the left. The guard spun toward the noise. Check it out, the mercenary ordered. As Miller moved away, Cillian and Sofia slipped past the gap on the right, moving deeper into the heart of the operation without firing a shot. They were close now. The sound of heavy machinery and shouting voices grew louder over the wind. They reached the final row of containers, overlooking the loading dock. The scene below was a hive of activity. A sleek, military-grade hydrofoil boat bobbed in the water, its engines idling with a deep thrum. Captain Marcus Holloway stood on the dock, screaming orders at a crew of men loading long olive-drab cases onto the deck. Next to him stood a man who didn't belong in Chicago, tall and gaunt, wearing a pristine white wool coat that stood out against the grime of the port. This was Agent Richard Voss, the corrupt DEA supervisor. He looked impatient, checking a platinum watch while his personal guard, a squad of elite mercenaries with advanced night vision gear, formed a protective ring around the transaction. Faster, Holloway yelled, his voice cracking with panic. The network says the feds are 2 hours out, but I don't trust the weather to hold. Your network is twitchy, Captain, Voss said, his voice smooth and cold. But I agree. Load the product first. The rest is just paperwork. Cillian tapped his headset. Rook, do you have a solution on the boat's engine? Negative, Rook replied. Structure is blocking the angle. I can take out the guards, but if that boat leaves, the product goes with it. Cillian looked at the distance, 50 yards of open ground. Breaker, we need a diversion. Blow the crane power box on my mark. Sofia raised her rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs. She aligned her sights on Holloway, but her hands shook. This was the man who had pinned her badge on her at graduation. Steady, Cillian whispered, sensing her turmoil. Breathe. Mark, Cillian said. High above them, a small explosion popped, followed by a shower of sparks as the massive floodlights illuminating the pier died instantly, plunging the dock into semi-darkness. Go! Cillian roared, breaking cover. Chaos erupted. The sudden darkness caused the mercenaries to shout in confusion, their night vision flaring white for a blinding second. Cillian and Sofia advanced, firing controlled bursts to suppress the guards. Rook's sniper rifle began to bark from the sky, taking out the lights on the boat. Contact! Front! A mercenary screamed. The air filled with the snap and hiss of supersonic rounds. Phantom was a blur of motion, not attacking recklessly, but moving methodically to flush enemies out of cover for Cillian to engage. They pushed forward, using the pallets of cargo for cover. Holloway, realizing he was under attack, scrambled toward the boat, abandoning his men. "Hold them back," he shrieked. Voss's personal guard, realizing this wasn't a police raid but a surgical strike, moved with deadly efficiency. They didn't panic, they counterattacked. A team of 3 mercenaries flanked right, moving through the shadows to cut off Cillian's advance. Phantom stopped mid-stride, his ears swiveling. He barked once, a sharp warning, and looked to the right. Cillian saw them too late. Right flank. "Sofia, cover," he shouted, spinning to engage. But one mercenary had already drawn a bead on Sofia, who was exposed while reloading. The laser sight danced on her chest. There was no time for Cillian to aim. No time for Sofia to move. But Phantom was faster than human reaction time. The German Shepherd launched himself from a crouch, a 60-pound missile of muscle and fury, intercepting the mercenary's line of fire just as the trigger broke. A gunshot rang out, distinct and sickening. Phantom yelped, a high-pitched sound that tore through Cillian's heart, and tumbled mid-air, crashing into the snow. But the dog didn't stay down. The bullet had grazed his hind leg, tearing a gash through the muscle, but the drive to protect was stronger than the pain. Phantom scrambled up, blood spraying on the white snow, and threw himself at the shooter, sinking his teeth into the man's padded arm and dragging him to the ground. "Phantom!" Sofia screamed, horror washing over her. She raised her rifle, her hesitation gone, evaporated by the sight of the dog's sacrifice. She put 2 rounds into the mercenary struggling with Phantom, ending the threat instantly. "I've got him. Cover the dog," she yelled, moving forward, not as a tentative rookie, but as a fierce protector. She stood over the injured animal, laying down a wall of suppressive fire that forced the other flankers to retreat. Phantom, panting heavily and favoring his left leg, didn't retreat to safety. He limped to Sofia's side, pressing his body against her leg to steady her, his teeth bared at the darkness, blood dripping from his flank to stain the pristine snow crimson. He looked up at her, his eyes wild but focused, telling her he was still in the fight. Cillian reached them, sliding into cover beside the crate. He glanced at Phantom's wound. Nasty, bleeding freely, but no artery hit. "He's combat effective," Cillian said, though his voice was tight with worry. "He bought us a second. We have to use it." He looked at Sofia, seeing the change in her. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. She reached down and squeezed Phantom's ear briefly. "Good boy," she choked out. Then she looked at the boat, where Holloway was trying to cast off. "Let's finish this," she said. With a limping dog and a relentless soldier at her side, Sofia Reeves charged into the storm to take back her city. The battle for Pier 9 had dissolved into a smoking ruin of twisted metal and shattered silence. The mercenaries, realizing their paycheck was no longer guaranteed and facing the precision fire of a Navy SEAL team, had largely scattered or been incapacitated. Agent Richard Voss, the corrupt DEA supervisor, had vanished into the night on a secondary escape launch, cutting his losses like the cold businessman he was, leaving his partner to face the consequences alone. Captain Marcus Holloway was now a man alone on a freezing dock, his empire of corruption crumbling around him with every snowflake that hissed against the hot metal of spent casings. He scrambled over the slick deck of the hydrofoil, his breath coming in ragged, panic-stricken gasps, his eyes darting wildly. He knew he couldn't outrun the law anymore, and he couldn't outshoot a SEAL team. But Holloway was a man who believed in scorched earth. If he couldn't have the victory, no one would. He sprinted toward the open cargo hold where the crates containing the 2 tons of fentanyl sat, rigged with a failsafe he had installed for exactly this scenario. A block of C4 wired to a remote detonator, enough to vaporize the evidence and anyone foolish enough to be standing near it. Cillian Carter saw the desperation in Holloway's movement. He broke cover, sprinting across the icy dock with a speed that defied the treacherous conditions. "Sofia?" "The crate." Cillian roared over the comms. "He's going for the failsafe." Sofia didn't need to be told twice. She saw Holloway dive into the boat's cabin, and she vaulted over the railing, her boots skidding on the wet fiberglass. Phantom, limping but fueled by an adrenaline that masked the pain in his hind leg, scrambled after her, a low growl rumbling in his chest like a diesel engine. Cillian reached the cabin just as Holloway turned, a detonator clutched in his hand like a talisman. Cillian didn't slow down. He lowered his shoulder and slammed into the corrupt captain, tackling him into the bulkhead with a bone-jarring crash. The detonator skittered across the floor, sliding toward the open hatch where Sofia was pulling herself up. "You stupid grunt." Holloway spat, driving a knee into Cillian's ribs. "You don't know what you're doing. This isn't about right and wrong. It's about survival." Cillian absorbed the blow, gritting his teeth, and countered with a sharp jab to Holloway's solar plexus. The fight was ugly and desperate, a brawl in a confined space where skill battled against sheer, frantic terror. Holloway wasn't a soldier, but he was a street cop who had survived Chicago's worst neighborhoods for 30 years. He fought dirty, gouging at eyes, clawing at gear. He managed to shove Cillian back, pulling a hidden backup pistol from his ankle holster. Survival. Cillian wheezed, knocking the gun aside just as it discharged into the ceiling. "You call selling poison that kills thousands survival? That's just cowardice wrapped in a paycheck. Honor doesn't pay the mortgage, Carter." Holloway screamed, his face twisted into a mask of greed and resentment. "You think the city cares about you? You think the flag keeps you warm at night? I took what was owed to me. I built a retirement fund while you played hero in the sand." He swung a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall bracket, catching Cillian on the shoulder. The SEAL stumbled, his arm going numb. Cillian looked at the man, seeing not a monster, but something smaller, sadder, a man hollowed out by his own avarice until there was nothing human left inside. "Honor isn't currency, Holloway," Cillian said, his voice deadly calm despite the pain radiating through his arm. "It's the thing that lets you look in the mirror. It's the reason I sleep, and you run." While the two men clashed, Sofia scrambled toward the crate of fentanyl in the cargo hold. The timer on the explosive charge had been triggered by the impact of the fight, a fail-safe motion sensor. The red digital numbers were racing down, 045, 044. Panic flared in her chest, cold and sharp. She wasn't an EOD specialist. She was a cop. She looked at the tangled nest of wires, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Breaker!" she screamed into her headset. "I need help. It's counting down." Breaker's voice came back instantly, calm and reassuring, the anchor in the storm. "I see it on your body cam, Sofia. Take a breath. Do not cut the red wire. That's a Hollywood trope. Look for the power source. The battery pack. There's a yellow lead and a black lead. You need to sever the ground wire, the black one, but you have to hold the yellow one tight against the contact until the circuit drains. Can you do that?" I don't have wire cutters," Sofia sobbed, frantically patting her vest. She had lost her utility tool in the scramble. The timer blinked, 020. She looked around desperately. Phantom nudged her arm, whining softly. He was looking at the wires, tilting his head. Sofia realized she didn't need cutters. She grabbed the black wire, wrapping it around her gloved finger. "I'm going to pull it," she whispered. "Now." She yanked the black wire free while pressing her thumb hard against the yellow connection. The timer flickered, 010, 009, and then the numbers went dark. The hum of the explosive ceased. Sofia slumped against the crate, gasping for air, the silence of the deactivated bomb sounding like the sweetest music she had ever heard. But the silence was short-lived. A gunshot rang out from the cabin. Sofia scrambled up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She rushed to the doorway to see Cillian on his back, dazed, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Holloway stood over him, panting heavily, the gun leveled at Cillian's chest. He had managed to retrieve his weapon in the scuffle. A triumphant, ugly sneer curled his lip. "You talk too much, hero," Holloway rasped, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You stopped the bomb? Fine. I'll just kill you both and sink the boat. Dead men don't testify." Cillian stared up at the barrel, his eyes defiant. He had no weapon in hand, no room to maneuver. He braced himself for the end, his only regret that he hadn't finished the job. "Drop it." The command didn't come from Cillian. It came from the shadows of the deck. Holloway spun around, surprised. Sofia Reeves stood there, her feet planted wide in a perfect shooting stance, her M4 carbine raised and steady. She looked nothing like the terrified victim he had left in the storm drain. She looked like justice incarnate, battered and bruised, but unbreakable. Sofia. Holloway laughed, though the sound was brittle. Put the toy away. You can't shoot me. You're a cop. You follow the rules. You need me for trial. If you shoot me, you're just like me. He turned his gun back toward Cillian, betting his life on her morality. Go home, little girl. This is men's work. Sofia didn't blink. She didn't scream. She simply exhaled, centering her sight picture, just as Cillian had taught her hours ago. Ride the recoil. She squeezed the trigger. Bang. Holloway screamed as his right kneecap disintegrated in a spray of red mist. He collapsed to the deck, the gun skittering out of his hand and over the side of the boat into the dark water. He writhed in agony, clutching his shattered leg, howling curses at the sky. Sofia moved forward, keeping her rifle trained on his center mass. She didn't look at his wound. She looked at his eyes. You're right, Holloway, Sofia said, her voice cutting through his screams like a razor. I am a cop, and that's why you're breathing. She stepped closer, kicking his other leg apart to ensure he couldn't mobilize. Phantom limped forward, positioning himself between Sofia and the fallen captain, a low, rumbling growl emanating from his chest that vibrated the deck plates. The dog stood guard, his teeth bared inches from Holloway's face, daring him to move a muscle. Cillian pulled himself up, wiping the blood from his eyes. He looked at Sofia with a mixture of awe and relief. She reached behind her belt and pulled out a pair of handcuffs, not her own, but an old, scuffed pair she had taken from Cortez's locker earlier that day. She grabbed Holloway's wrist, twisting it behind his back with practiced force, ignoring his whimpers. The metal clicked shut, a sound of finality that echoed across the water. Captain Marcus Holloway, Sofia recited, her voice steady and ringing with the authority of the law she had sworn to uphold. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. As she spoke the words, the sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder, closing in from the city streets. The FBI had arrived, too late to save the day, but just in time to witness the victory. Cillian leaned against the bulkhead, watching her. He saw the way her hands stopped shaking as the cuffs locked. He saw the dignity she reclaimed with every word of the Miranda warning. She hadn't taken revenge. She had delivered justice. And in doing so, she had saved herself. He reached out and rested a hand on Phantom's head. The dog stopped growling and leaned into his touch, his job done. Good work, partner, Cillian whispered to both of them. The snow continued to fall, covering the blood and the scars of the battle. But the truth was finally out in the open, cold and undeniable. The gavel came down with a sound that cracked through the heavy silence of the federal courtroom like a rifle shot, sealing the fate of the man who had tried to sell his city's soul for a retirement fund. It was a federal trial, a rare and solemn proceeding convened because of the nature of the crimes and the involvement of federal agencies, held in a windowless chamber of polished oak and stone that smelled of history and judgment. Captain Marcus Holloway stood in the defendant's box, stripped of his uniform, wearing a drab orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. Gone was the arrogance of the peer, replaced by the hollow, sunken look of a man who realized too late that he was mortal. Agent Richard Voss stood beside him in an identical jumpsuit. The DEA supervisor had been caught trying to board a private plane to Paraguay 48 hours after the peer raid. The USB drive had led federal marshals directly to him. The presiding judge, Judge Margaret Sterling, a woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had presided over organized crime cases for 20 years, read the sentence with a voice devoid of pity. Captain Marcus Holloway, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. Agent Richard Voss, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at the same facility. You will be transferred immediately into federal custody. As the bailiffs moved in to shackle them, Holloway looked back into the gallery, searching for a sympathetic face, but found only the stony expressions of the men and women he had betrayed. In the front row, Cillian Carter sat straight-backed in his dress blues, the gold trident on his chest catching the harsh fluorescent light. His hand rested calmly on the knee of the woman beside him. Sofia Reeves wore a black dress suit, her police badge absent. She had resigned from the force the day after the raid, her face serene. They didn't smile as Holloway was led away. Justice wasn't a game to be won, but a balance to be restored. And the weight of it was solemn. Behind them sat a small crowd of people whose lives had been touched by the case. Doc O'Malley, hands folded in his lap, eyes misty. Rook and Breaker, in civilian clothes, nodding with grim satisfaction. Ghost, who had uploaded the entire USB drive contents to every major news outlet and federal agency simultaneously, ensuring there could be no cover-up. And in the back row, wearing his dress uniform, sat a young man with Cortez's eyes, the lieutenant's son, Michael, holding a folded flag from his father's funeral. 2 weeks later, the chill of winter finally broke, giving way to the tentative warmth of an early Chicago spring. The snow that had once covered the city in a shroud of white melted away to reveal the green shoots of life pushing through the earth. At the Oak Ridge Veterans Cemetery, a small crowd gathered around a fresh headstone in Section 9, where the scars of the explosion had been repaired with fresh sod. A flag-draped coffin had been lowered into the ground weeks ago, honored by a 21-gun salute that echoed off the granite hills. Today was different. Today was about remembrance. Sofia stood by the grave as a new memorial plaque was unveiled, a bronze plate that read, Lieutenant James Cortez, Chicago Police Department, 1967 to 2025. For the badge, for the people, for the truth. Medal of Valor. The police commissioner, a new man, appointed in the wake of the scandal, knelt and presented a folded flag to Michael Cortez, who stood with his mother and younger sister. On behalf of a grateful city and a proud department, the commissioner said softly, "Your father's sacrifice will never be forgotten. He stood against corruption when others looked away. He is what every officer should aspire to be." Sofia felt a hand on her shoulder and looked up to see Cillian standing there, solid as the oak trees surrounding them. He didn't say anything, but the pressure of his hand told her everything she needed to know. Cortez had cleared his name. He hadn't died a fool or a victim. He had died a hero, and now he could finally rest. 6 months drifted by, the seasons turning the page from the gray of grief to the golden hues of healing. It was a Saturday afternoon in late June, the kind of day that artists try to paint and poets try to describe, a perfect slice of American summer. Cillian stood on a ladder, a hammer in his hand, repairing the lattice on the wraparound porch of a modest white clapboard house they had bought on the edge of town. He wore worn denim jeans and a t-shirt stained with sawdust, the tension that used to coil in his shoulders completely gone. He wasn't looking over his shoulder for insurgents or listening for the whistle of incoming mortars. His mission now was simple: fix the loose board on the third step and make sure the grill was hot enough for the ribs. He paused to wipe sweat from his brow, looking out over the yard where Phantom was currently engaged in a high-stakes game of tag with a sprinkler. The German Shepherd, his leg fully healed, leaving only a jagged scar hidden beneath his fur, barked joyfully, snapping at the oscillating stream of water, acting more like a puppy than a decorated war dog. The screen door creaked open, and Sofia stepped out carrying a tray of iced tea and lemonade. She looked different, lighter. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a spark of purpose. She had resigned from the police force a month after the trial, leaving her badge on the commissioner's desk with a note that simply said, "My watch has ended." She hadn't left service, though. She had just changed her battlefield. She was now the director of the Cortez Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping law enforcement officers and veterans transition out of toxic departments, providing legal support for whistleblowers, and pairing retired service members with rescue dogs that needed a job. "You're going to burn those ribs if you keep staring at the dog," Sofia teased, setting the tray down on the patio table. Cillian climbed down the ladder, grabbing a glass of tea. "The dog has better tactical movement than half my old platoon," he chuckled, watching Phantom shake himself dry, sending a spray of water over a bed of petunias. "Besides, I'm retired. I'm allowed to move slow." Cillian had received his discharge papers 3 weeks ago. It wasn't a medical discharge, nor was it forced. He had simply realized, standing in that cemetery, that he had fought enough wars for one lifetime. He had spent his youth running toward the sound of gunfire, but now he found more meaning in the quiet sound of the wind in the trees and the laughter of the woman he loved. "Did you get the mail?" Sofia asked, sitting down on the swing bench. Cillian nodded, pulling a thick envelope from his back pocket. "It came today, from the Department of the Navy." Sofia's breath caught for a second. "Is it?" Cillian smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Yeah, it's official. He opened the envelope and pulled out a velvet box. Inside lay a medal, not for him, but for the soldier who had taken a bullet in the snow. The K-9 Medal of Courage. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and burnt orange, they held a small, private ceremony in the backyard. There were no generals, no news cameras, no fanfare. Just Cillian, Sofia, and a few close friends. Rook, who brought a potato salad that was surprisingly good. Breaker, who brought a cooler of beer and stories that got more exaggerated with every retelling. Ghost, who mostly kept to himself but smiled more than anyone had ever seen. Doc O'Malley, sitting in a lawn chair, smoking a pipe, nodding approvingly. Cillian whistled for Phantom. The dog trotted over, sensing the shift in mood, and sat at attention, his chest puffed out. Cillian knelt on one knee in the grass, eye level with his best friend. Phantom, Cillian said, his voice thick with emotion, for conspicuous gallantry in the face of the enemy, for protecting the team, for being the best boy. He clipped the medal onto Phantom's collar. The medal clinked softly against his tags. Phantom didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He licked Cillian's face, then turned to nudge Sofia's hand. Sofia knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his fur. "Thank you," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you for bringing him home. Thank you for saving me." Cillian reached out and took Sofia's hand. His palm was rough, calloused from years of holding rifles and climbing ropes, but his touch was gentle. Sofia squeezed back, her fingers interlocking with his. They stood up together, watching the fireflies begin to dance in the twilight air. The smell of charcoal smoke and cut grass filled the air, the scent of peace. "So," Sofia said softly, looking at the medal shining on Phantom's chest, "what's the mission now, sailor?" Cillian looked at the house they were fixing up, at the friends laughing on the porch, at the dog chasing fireflies, and finally at the woman who had crawled out of the darkness with him. He pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "The mission is right here," he said. "To live, to build something that lasts, and to make sure the only thing we ever have to fight is a leaky roof." They stood there as the stars began to poke through the canopy of the night. Two warriors who had laid down their swords to plant a garden. The nightmares of the sewer, the cold betrayal of the pier, the sacrifice at the cemetery. They felt like a lifetime ago, faded stories to be told in hushed tones years from now. Phantom barked once at the rising moon, a sound of pure defiance and joy, before trotting back to lie at their feet. The darkness had tried to take them, but they had held the line. And now, under the vast, protective dome of the American sky, they finally had the one thing they had fought for: a tomorrow. If this story of redemption, bravery, and the unbreakable bond between a warrior and his dog touched your heart, please like this video and share it with a friend or family member who needs a reminder that good still triumphs over evil. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that uplifts the spirit. And finally, if you believe in the power of second chances and the protection of those who serve, type Amen in the comments below to claim this prayer for yourself and your loved ones today. God bless you, and thank you for watching.